Welcome everyone to this panel discussion. I want to start by doing something a little bit different and ask the audience a question, or ask you to vote, okay? If we're talking about showcasing Japan, the two big questions I think we need to answer today are, what should we be communicating, and how should we be communicating it? They're the two big questions. The problem is communicating or communication or showcasing can mean many, many things. So let's keep it to a definition of building understanding and familiarity for Japan on the world stage. So I want to ask you if you think Japan is doing a good job or a bad job. And I'm going to ask you to put up your hand on a rating of 1 to 5. 5 being, yeah, they're really kicking ass out there. They're really doing a good job. And 1 being, ooh. So let's start. Who thinks it's a 5? Okay. Who thinks it's a 4? Okay, it's a 4. 3. We're obviously in Japan. Everyone's choosing the middle ground. 3. Who thinks it's a 2? Okay, and a 1. Okay. So, why a 1?
I think because if you're interested in Japan, then you know a lot about it as a foreigner. But if Japan is just something that's part of the rest of the world, it doesn't really differentiate. Okay. Or if people are being asked about Japan that don't have an interest in it, they often come up with old stereotypes as opposed to what happens nowadays.
Right. Once someone said to me that Japan is really hard to find. Yeah. You have to go looking for it. So is that it? And you said a 4, sir. Why was your 4 a 4?
But I think Japan is doing a very good job for people who are interested. And if you're not interested in a certain area or country, I don't think that's your target anyway. So I thought it was good. Now, if Japan is not your target and you're still approaching, then it would have been a 5. But it's a 4 because targeting only people with interest.
Okay, let's see what our panelists think. Martin.
I gave it a 2. And I gave it a 2 because I think it's doing 1 or 2 things very well. I would say it's done the Olympics very well because I was involved in that project. So it's in my interest to say that. I hope it did do well, and I hope it continues to do well. But I think in other ways, it is very, very difficult for Japan to engage with the rest of the world. And I put it down to one simple thing, which is the Japanese phrase that the nail that stands up gets hammered down. This means that people are not confident to go out there and talk about Japan, sell Japan, be passionate about Japan. They're very reserved, very polite, and very Japanese. And I think that's a big problem. And I think that helping people to do that is one of the most exciting projects available right now in this part of the world.
That's great. Marcy, in some of your roles, you've actually been someone in some of your roles who the characters are showcasing Japan or parts of Japan. How do you see this, and what's your score?
Well, for me, I thought it was a 2 as well. For me, I love Japan. I always want to be like the cheerleader for Japan. And it kind of, as Martin said, it takes someone outside to kind of talk about Japan because we do hammer the nail that sticks out here. And that is one of the things to be on the global stage, which I feel working with a lot of Japanese companies kind of fault at. Communication is kind of the way to kind of put it all, but in particular, marketing and negotiation. Marketing, boasting of who you are, what's great about yourself, and presenting that, and negotiating, saying what you really want. Those are 2 things that I find a lot of Japanese companies and Japanese people seem to have, reservations because it makes them look bad or selfish. And we're always, we had that village mentality. We care about people around us, and that actually kind of is it shackles us a little bit when we're trying to work and compete in a global market. So that's why I feel we could be a little bit more aggressive in sharing what's great about Japan to the world and being more presentational about it.
Okay, great, thanks. Naho, what was your score and why?
So actually, I give the score 1. Yeah, so sorry for that. Basically, I live in India, and I lived there past 12 years already. And what I realized is once I left from Japan, so to understand Japanese people and to communicate with Japanese people is really difficult. So even I'm Japanese, but still it's quite really difficult to understand. Yeah, so if we say about omotenashi, so what is the definition of the omotenashi? So it's quite really tough to make the verbal definitions. But then the Japanese people push to the people, so please understand omotenashi. But then if we ask them, so what is that? Nobody can explain for that. So something like that. So we have to think about how we can communicate to the people, what we want to tell to them. So that is my thought.
Okay, great. Stefan, if you give us your score, and then I'll come back to Martin, who will no doubt weigh in on omotenashi.
Yeah, my score was 1, partly because we were told to be provocative. Since I couldn't give a 0 because that wasn't an option, I gave a 1. In other circumstances, it might have been a 2. On the subject of the nail that sticks up, I mean, I can give a very practical example. In my work, I'm encouraging Japanese journalists to come up with op-ed ideas, opinion pieces, right? And I meet barriers. So I give a colleague who speaks very good English, that's not the problem, read this piece, it's come from so-and-so and so-and-so, and said, tell me what you think of it. And he says, Stefan-san, it doesn't matter what I think of it, I will agree with your opinion of it, unless our boss has a different opinion, in which case I will agree with the boss's opinion. Now, if you can't discuss ideas, even in the context of media, which by international standards tends to be a very open and discussion-friendly milieu, God knows what happened inside a Japanese bank or car company or other mining company. These internal discussions must be really difficult and closed, and they are. And if you can't have a sound internal discussion, how can you possibly have a sound external discussion engaging the rest of the world? I do, if I just may go on, but I'm not entirely negative. It sounds like we should stop right here. I don't think so. I lived in Japan 25 years ago, and I came back last year, as it were, for a second stint. And my first stint was 5 years, so I got a decent feel. It's got better, and I do believe that what I'm not supposed to call immigration is beginning to have an effect in Japan. The numbers are very striking. And I also think that foreign tourism is having an effect, because for the first time almost, many more Japanese people than before have to engage with foreigners in some way. And I think that this isn't just a joke. If you look in Europe, there are a number of countries where tourism transformed the mentality of the people. One is Spain, which under General Franco was almost closed, very poor country, has been transformed principally by tourism. And the other is Greece, again principally by tourism. And the third are the former communist countries of Eastern Europe, where it's a combination of tourism, business, and travel, and everything else. So that's where I would place my money.
That's great. Don't quote me on this data point because it's from memory, but I think I saw something not so long ago that said that 40% of the under 20 population in Shinjuku is now non-Japanese. And you can have similar quotes for some of the other kus. So certainly amongst the younger generation, that impact of non-immigration is very serious. Omotenashi, just focusing in on Naho's point about, are we trying to push omotenashi onto people too much? And what is the definition of omotenashi? Because I think it's important. As a PR guy, I always explain the difference between advertising and PR, as advertising being going up to a person in a bar, a girl in a bar, and saying, I'm a real handsome, nice guy, you should go out with me. That's advertising. Thank you, thank you. Whereas PR is getting her friend to tell her that I'm a really nice guy and she should go out with me. So maybe there are limitations in pushing that message. Martin, would you like to comment on?
Yeah, I was actually doing an interview with Christel Takigawa on Wednesday, and we both have omotenashi like tattooed on our foreheads. It's a curse that follows us around. I think that the point is that omotenashi is something very difficult and probably difficult to explain, and probably not worth explaining, because that's advertising. That's telling the girl that you're really cool and handsome. It's much better, rather than explaining it, to illustrate it, and it's very easy to illustrate it. And for me, the best illustration, one very good illustration, is how Japanese fans during the World Cup this summer stayed behind after matches to clean the stadiums. Now, in Japan, that's normal. In the rest of the world, that is amazing, incredible, because people are actually stopping and thinking about somebody else's experience and doing something about it, giving up some of their time to make the world a better place for other people. Now, that is amazing omotenashi. And the world's media and the world's public saw it and thought, oh my gosh, this is unlike anything you will get from any country in the world. So I don't think that Japan needs to move on from omotenashi or think about beyond omotenashi. I think it just needs more and to deepen it, because that stuff, actually giving people omotenashi, is the best possible message that Japan can send. And I think that in the 2020 Olympics, if Japan shows that to the world, and if everyone who comes here, if everyone in the media, if all the public, if all the athletes experience, not the definition of, but the actual living experience of omotenashi, that story will go wild around the world.
I hear that before the Beijing Olympics, the Chinese government shut down all the factories so there would be no pollution. I'm not quite sure the Japanese government will have the same ability to order people to clean up the streets and take their rubbish home as great examples during the Olympics. But Masi, how can we get people to communicate that omotenashi? Is that enough?
I think, we understand it as a culture living here, and we can experience it. And, most of the times when people aren't interested in Japan, the first entry point is the media and content. So to have great stories, having that stories, narrative is always a great way of communicating and empathizing with our culture. And it's true, it's hard to tell something, and it's much easier to show something. But, and for me, omotenashi is about that welcoming spirit. So the more people we can get people here, and the more welcoming we are to the people around us, who can take that and spread it around the world, I think definitely the better. So I think we could have a lot more cultural programs, more visitation, especially like influencers as well. And like Israel has a program where they invite, at least from a Hollywood perspective, like 10 or 20 artists, influencers come to Tel Aviv for one week. And all they have to do is just post on social media how great it was, that experience. But things like that, we don't do that, and we need to be more aggressive about welcoming people inside, because we Japanese ourselves might not be comfortable pushing that message forward aggressively as other people might.
Okay. But I think it was Sweden a couple of years ago that had this wonderful campaign, Call a Swede. Yeah. And it was run, and there were random telephone numbers. Yeah. And people from around the world could call these telephone numbers and speak to a Swede. and it was an immensely successful campaign that got Swedish people really interested in speaking English and learning about other countries, and other countries wanting to learning about Japanese. So it was a great way to cross that bridge. Now, would you like to add perhaps to Masi's comment about how we can get people to understand that welcoming? I think maybe a model is Thailand. That Sweden campaign is great, but Thailand is known the world over for the country of smiles and that welcoming thing. Can we get something like that going for Japan?
Yeah. Yeah, so like in the omotenashi and the inbound, and something like coming to Japan or etc., that is very important. But on the same time, we also have to think about how we Japanese people can go outside and how we can showcase ourselves. Yeah. So in the omotenashi is to create a definition of omotenashi is a bit tough. Even myself, I cannot explain what exactly it is. Even we say hospitality, there is a shortage of the things. Yeah, and even we say about something different. So, but we cannot define. And omotenashi, the definition of the omotenashi has to upgrade. Depends on the situation and depends on the people. So the important thing is, and of course, and we can showcase Japan as to invite the people from outside to here, and on the same times, we Japanese people or we the person who live in Japan can go back to their country and we can show it to the people. So that is one thing which I can add to him.
Does omotenashi need to be defined? Can omotenashi not just be the spirit of omotenashi, like smiles are in Thailand? Stefan?
Yeah, definition, not definition. I'm always looking at sort of practical things. One practical thing is the English language. One can talk about languages and influence and cultural imperialism and so on, but the fact is that most of the world does communicate in English if it's a second language. And I think it's quite important that Japanese finally develop a bit more confidence in speaking English, even to strangers, but not only. It's striking, again, I go back because I've been here a long time ago. At that time, you sort of had an excuse, but because the fluent English speakers tended to be people either from Anglo-Saxon countries or the United States and so on, or from former colonies. So the Japanese could sort of console themselves, well, it's only those people. But now if you go to China, you are literally accosted by people. They queue up to practice their English. Now, I'm not saying I want to repeat this particular experience on the Tokyo Metro every day, but this is how you do it, by doing it. And just just going back to the Olympics and the practical things, I understand that tens of thousands of volunteers are being recruited by the various stadia and the organisers and so on. It would be great if there was a percentage targeted to foreigners resident in Japan. Perhaps that's already being done. But if it were, it would really be a symbol of integration, which would be useful both internally and especially to present that much more of a friendlier face to the rest of the world, and also with those language skills. And not just English, I'm talking Thai, Korean. There are many, many languages in Tokyo.
Can I add one more thing? And one more thing about omotenashi, it's about, for me, it's about welcoming and also thinking about others. But I think that one thing that I would like to see is more people going, more Japanese folks going abroad and then coming back. Because it's not just about thinking about others, it's about thinking like the others. And how being able to perceive Japan from the way how other people think, I think will allow us to present us much, much more. So that's the difference thing. Rather than being passive, guessing what people will want and trying to not disrupt, it's about being more active about, oh, okay, this is what they need. And we could think like how they think. And I think that might help us also spread the message further.
If I could just, again, one of the depressing things this time to learn coming back here is how this has changed, that 25 years ago, young Japanese were considerably keener than their parents and grandparents to go abroad, to travel, right, and to even be posted abroad. I'm told now by managers and people I speak to, it's actually harder than it was to get young Japanese to go abroad than their parents, and I think that's terrible.
Yes, even when I travel for business now, as I'm leaving, my wife always says to me, "Don't get shot." If I'm going, don't get shot. She says, well, "You're going to New York. Everyone gets shot in New York. It's common knowledge, you know." But there is that sort of negative image. Although, coming back to your point about the English language, I have had a couple of experiences recently, and I've been in Japan 40 years, where I've got in a taxi and said to the taxi driver where I want to go in Japanese, and he's answered to me in English and asked me, can he practice his English, because he is studying for the Olympics. And my sense is that there is actually a lot of this beginning to go on. And I wonder whether we shouldn't do a campaign like Sweden, where we have hashtag I'm ready, call me, or something like that, and you can create a movement or a platform where all those people that are getting ready, trying to learn their English, can start communicating that spirit of omotenashi. But the title says Beyond Omotenashi. So let's move off omotenashi for a while. Ask the question, leave the question pending there, is omotenashi enough? And thinking about the overall title of this conference, about the bringing the world together and what Japan can be doing for that. in terms of communicating Japan's role in the world, what should we be doing? Stefan?
Yeah, well, it all begins with what you think your message is. And if I've heard other panels this morning, one thing that Japanese politicians, the political elite, thinks of when it thinks of its role, it's to do with bridge building, it's to do with a peaceful approach to problem solving and consensus and so on. If I think around the world, is there any other country that takes a similar approach? I'm not an exhaustive list, but I think Switzerland might be something of a model. Switzerland also projects this kind of face to the world. It's the home of the Red Cross, the home of disproportionate number of UN organizations, and so on. And so what's the difference there? Now, the difference is that, and this goes back to what we've just been talking about, is that the Swiss have been engaged with their neighbors for hundreds of years. And so they've had lots of practice at communicating this Swiss message. And so I think that if this is the message that Japanese political elite wants to, and it's a very, very valid one and very necessary in the world right now, then it needs to think about how do we get that across, and there it's all to do with engagement. There's no other way around it.
Naho, would you like to make a comment on that from your perspective from India?
I think that Japan can be the intermediary and for the several countries, and somehow. But before that, what we have to think about is where and which position Japan want to take in culturally and economically and politically. So we have to think about these kinds of things. But I believe Japan can think about the several points. Between country and country, and sometimes between religion and religion. Yeah, so that is sometimes the Japanese people, the people say, and Japanese people is very fuzzy, and they don't have the actual independent ways, or etc. etc. But sometimes it can turn to the strong point as well. So yeah, somehow we have to think about where we want to go. And then we have to show it to the people how we can reach to there. So that is one of the things which I think.
That's great. In my world, and Pea's world as well, where we look at communications, we are seeing a major shift. And the world is moving from fact-based communication to emotion-based communication. And you can go out there with facts as much as you want, and people will ignore them or challenge them, or they will have alternative facts, and it's becoming very much more about emotion and the appeal to emotion. Masi, as an actor and producer, you must be very involved in sort of those characters and emotion. So in terms of that construct, what could Japan be doing to communicate its message in a more effective way, given that just throwing out the facts is probably not going to be enough anymore?
Well, definitely emotion and narrative is something that people gravitate towards. And if you have an emotional investment in something, they will stick with it. You know, I think with anything with like new technology or anything, people will come see it, give it a chance for its novelty. But whether they stay in it is whether they have emotional investment in it. And I think that's part of what art is. And for me, coming from an art background, people around the world, is really interested in Japanese content in particular. We say cool Japan, and we kind of throw things out. First of all, as we always say, saying something cool already is just not cool. But what we think is cool is not necessarily what the world thinks is cool or what people in America want to see. So it's about supply and demand. And in content, in particular, a lot of the anime, the food, the cuisine. But I think that's where a lot of the people will have emotional investment. If you go see the anime expos in like Japan, in like U.S. and in France and stuff, people are so invested in it, and that's their attachment. And those are the people who care about Japan and who really want to learn about Japan and fall in love with these characters. So what I love to see is definitely more of openness of pushing that, and also working with artists abroad and trying to have more collaboration. I think that is a great way for the Japan to go out for. Maybe we're not as good as pushing ourselves, but there are so many fans around the world, maybe not in numbers, but in quality. If we get some of those great artists, people who love Japan, and work with them more, and have them be the envoys, that might be a great, they can become our great bridge in terms of getting our message abroad and keeping it emotional through art.
That's a very interesting approach using through art. Martin, as we go into the Olympics, how can the Olympics be used as a platform? I think the last Olympics in 1964 was relatively simple. There was a very clear message. We don't yet seem to have a very clear message of what we're going to communicate or showcase. We hear about driverless cars and we hear about robots and things like that, but how can Japan effectively use the Olympics as a platform for getting its message across?
One of the things that happened in the last Olympics in Tokyo was that you launched the bullet train. You launched that train. You know, there was something amazing new that the world hadn't seen before. I don't think that's going to happen this time. I don't think it's that simple. We're not in that particular era. For me, it's about the human interface. And if I tell you my biggest hope, it's also my biggest concern and worry about the human interface. During those weeks when the Olympic and Paralympic, let's not forget, games happen in Tokyo, any idea that government spokesmen or official ambassadors or heads of corporations are the face of Japan goes out of the window. The face of Japan, beamed into every living room around the world, will be young athletes. At the moment, the media department of the Tokyo Organizing Committee for the Olympic Games has got a tiny handful of athletes who it will confidently put forward as communicators with international media. A tiny handful. It's a mixture of language skills, media skills, confidence, a whole set of things. Unless that changes, then the face of Japan during the Olympic year, during that important year, during those vital weeks when Japan beams into every living room in the world, will be, I can guarantee, safe, middle-aged bureaucrats. So there's a huge job of upskilling to be done if Japan really wants to use this moment of opportunity, because it's the human face that really matters.
Stefan, coming back to your point in connection with Martin's point just now about how immigration and tourism is changing things. So I'm thinking a year before the Olympics at the Rugby World Cup, and I was having a conversation with someone about this the other day, and in the Rugby World Cup there are a number of stadiums in rural areas. Kamaishi, a famous steel town up in the north, for instance, which is well known. And I'm thinking of the construct where suddenly 1,000 very large Fijian rugby fans show up in Kamaishi and want to go out for a couple of drinks after the match, and they descend upon the bars of Kamaishi, and what's going to happen? I think that's a great business opportunity, crisis, issues management, and whatever like that. But as we head into this era of tourism, is the infrastructure in place? Is the mindset infrastructure in place to be able to cope with this, in the sense that it may actually backfire? If we have suddenly all the bars in Kamaishi saying no English, no foreigners allowed, that presents a very negative image. So is the mindset infrastructure in place, do you think?
We won't know for sure until it happens, and the chances are it's going to happen somewhere where that infrastructure and mindset is not in place. Otherwise, there won't be an incident, if you see what I mean. My own view that it's certainly much better than it was. It is improving in the right direction. It would be good if the authorities in some of the other cities showed the engagement that the authorities here in Tokyo are in terms of the Olympics. You mentioned taxi drivers learning English. The policemen are also remarkably assiduous in practicing English, which is quite fun, but not as far as I can see outside. So one thing I would do now, there's still a bit of time, would be to engage those local authorities more. And whether it will be enough, I think we'll see. I mean, talking of bars and evenings and so on, and I've never been to Kameishi. I'm sure it's a lovely place, but there are so many places in Japan where the bars close at 9 o'clock that those Fijians may have a real problem getting a drink at all.
Yes, the downside, of course, as a policeman, I got caught speeding the other day, and in days past, you used to speak English and they just let you go. And he said, "This place, 50, you 70. Speed, speed." And I got a ticket, so it's not all good. It's not all good. In terms of thinking about Japan's role in helping this fractured world that we live in, Martin made a very interesting point at the pre-meeting, that the power of the Omotenashi message was not in the word Omotenashi at the Olympic speech, a presentation, but it was the fact that it was delivered by a French-Japanese person. And that was perhaps a little bit of a surprise. It was something new, it was topical, and it was a bridge. Can Japan play a role as a bridge in this fractured world, is the question. Each of you, please, before we go into Q&A. So kicking off with you, Martin.
Obviously, this is a conversation which any of us, I guess, in this room have probably had at some point or other. I think that very often Japan is thinking, how do we tell the story of the world of Japan to the world? And I like to flip that question and say, how can we talk about Japan's links with the world rather than how separate and different it is? So for me, we talk about a crisis in Japanese-Chinese relationships. Whereas the exhibition in Tokyo and then traveling the world, sponsored by the Japanese government, talking about the influence, the positive influence of China on Japan's cultural evolution. The fact that the script comes from China. Where is the exhibition in Tokyo and traveling the world talking about how a large part of religion practiced in Japan comes from India? Where are the stories that show these long, deep historical links between Japan and the world? It's not building new bridges because you've been isolated from the world forever and now you have to build bridges. It's talking about how Japan has always been part of the world and how that's a positive thing. And I don't see enough of that story being told.
Good point, Masi.
No, I think that's a great point. I totally agree with that. And it comes back to my concept of collaboration, whether it's through the art, it's working together. That is something that's very uniquely Japanese, that is harmony. The word wa is something that we're very proud of. And to be able to work with people is something that we should showcase. And that's something that other countries don't do. I mean, I think there was a report that our passport allows us to anywhere in the world. It's allowed at the most powerful power. And that says something about the concept of us as a culture. And it's also difficult. I mean, I talked about going abroad as well, but we have to draw that fine line of maintaining what's great about Japan and how we are as a culture, as well as welcoming and working with it. So that's part of the evolution process. And I think definitely, with the more collaboration, putting more of the positive things, especially in the fractured world. In the United States, number 45 is kind of disrupting us by putting America first. Japan's not like that, and that's what's great about that. And the more we could, work together with the world and send that positive message, I think it will have a powerful impact.
Masi, China spends a huge amount of money on cultural centers in American universities. It spends a huge amount of money in spending Chinese students to I'll be totally open and honest. When I travel overseas, I tend to turn on CCTV in the hotel room rather than I do in HK World. CCTV is actually a lot more interesting. Could Japan's government be doing more in those areas in using tax dollars to get the message out?
Absolutely. There's two ways. One is actually welcoming more filming in Japan. We don't have a film commission that's set up. People are interested in Japan, want to film in Japan, but the Japanese government doesn't make it easy for that with lack of tax incentives. And what happens is they shoot in Vancouver, they shoot in New Zealand to pretend Japan, so we don't send the great message. The other thing is, things for China, as you said, the human interface is really important. Having a face. I'm sorry, I'm one person. And I play a Japanese character, but we have so many great other Japanese faces, and the more we have on screen, as a media is an entry point. It's the entry point for people who don't know Japan. And to see Japanese faces, Japanese artists as well, and athletes on screen is a huge thing. And Chinese government does that well because in order to show a movie in China, which is now the biggest market in the world, you have to have the Chinese government says that mandates that you have to shoot in China, you have to have their script approved by Chinese folks, and you have to cast Chinese leads. And the way Hollywood thinks is, in order to get the Chinese box office, we need to cast. When there's an Asian role, we're going to go Chinese and not Japanese and not Korean. So that takes even more. So China is using Hollywood as a propaganda and a media propaganda to spread good images of China. In the past, they didn't care what it was, but now they have script control because they know they have leverage in the box office. They're using that as a good way of promoting good images of China around the world. And that's where Japan now, when we start to wake up and realize we need to start doing that, it's going to be too late. We're being leveraged down. Even Korea doesn't see us as rivals anymore or partners. China and Korea already has their mindsets, and the less that we try to support that kind of media, and especially doesn't have government support, I think the further we'll lose that leverage of content, and we'll start to have less power in terms of content space.
Now, from where you sit in India, how much exposure do you have to Japanese content?
It's quite tough, actually. Yeah, so only some of the animation is there. Yeah, but in the India, most of the Indian people, so animation is only for the kids. Yeah, so if we say, okay, we have some of the animation for the adult people, they are asking me, what is that? So that is animation is only for the kids, they are saying. So if we only rely on some kinds of the contents and from Japan, so that is it's very tough to communicate.
Is there a lot of economic news? I know Prime Minister Abe and Prime Minister Modi seem to have a very good relationship where you've got a high-speed train.
Yeah, of course. And on the business perspective, so it is very important. And every year, I think the next 2 weeks, Prime Minister Modi will come to Japan. So this kind of is very important. But then once the Prime Minister comes or goes, and then they create the news. But after a few months, nobody remembers.
Nobody remembers.
Yeah. So of course, on the governments, so they are working closely, and they can do that. But on the same time, so the private company or us, we have to work on something more because only for the government. So after then, so nothing will work. Yeah.
Stefan, since Nikkei acquired the FT, there has been an extremely good increase in the amount of international news or regional news that is coming into Nikkei. I can see that. Does it go the other way? Is the FT beginning to report more on Japan, or is China still more important?
Good question. I'm glad it's off the record. There is an exchange of stories. I don't know how many, but the FT does publish, I think it's 2 or 3 Nikkei origins, so Nikkei stories in translation. Sometimes they need to be reworked for a foreign audience. But essentially, let's say they're Nikkei stories. So we certainly do that. There have been a number of joint ventures in terms of special reports where Nikkei and FT journalists have together collaborated. It works better in practice when each does his own story or her own story than you try and get 2 people to write the same story. But I think that's true of journalists anyway, quite frankly. So we do that. And there are a number of projects in the pipeline that I couldn't possibly talk about.
Do you, from the last time you were here and this time, do you think that the language barrier is lower in terms of communicating about Japan than it was when you were last here 20-something years ago?
Yes, definitely more people can and do speak English, that's true. Also, the comfort level. You may not believe this, but it was extremely difficult to get a cup of coffee outside Tokyo. Never mind anything else. I see the older heads, more experienced, heads are nodding. But perhaps younger people don't even believe that because coffee has now become such a Japanese phenomenon, but it's true. Cheese was not only was it unobtainable, it was regarded as disgusting. So in that sense, life has become definitely more international. The Japanese chefs have become masters of almost every cuisine. I read recently that they won the World Pizza Championships, beating both the Americans and the Italians into a cocked hat. So all that's great. But I think we also need to look at areas of weakness. I mean, Japanese universities have become more international. They do have more foreign students and so on, and more probably professors. But this is a competitive race. If you look at the rankings of world universities and you see how few Japanese institutions are in the top 50 or 100 or even 500, whereas 30 years ago, the number of Chinese in this list was zero, literally zero. And now the Chinese got several times more, I forget the numbers, but several times more than the Japanese. And relatively small countries, Australia, really do well. So this is an area where effort and talent and focus on what you want to do can have real effects within an acceptable period. We're not talking of the cultural change of the whole country. We're looking at specific institutions.
I'm thinking of a very cute story that I saw on Japanese TV recently. There's this small village in the Goto Islands off Nagasaki, and they were suffering because they were all old people, had no young people. So on their homepage, they put out an offer that if you would come to live in that village and you were below a certain age and had young children, that they would give you a house and pay you 50,000 yen a month. And so they put this out on their homepage. After a month or so, they had no one taking up the offer. No one taking up the offer. So the town council or the village council all got together and they said, well, what can we do about this? And they said, well, we're a dairy community, so let's throw in a cow. So they put a free house, 50,000 yen monthly income, and a cow. And within a month, they had 3,000 applications. Not one of the applications was from Japan. The power of Google search and Google translation. They had people from Cambodia, from South America, all wanting to take up this offer of the house and the cow. And I think they closed the offer very discreetly, but it just suggests to me that we are increasingly in a world where the language barrier is becoming lower and lower. Okay, the audience. Yes, and the hand goes up.
Abigail Friedman, thank you very much for this. I thought it was fascinating. One of the things that did fascinate me was that not one person talked about the reports coming out on Japan's role on the gender index. And those of us who have lived in Japan, love Japan, know how wonderful Japan is. But in terms of messaging, that's a message that I wouldn't say everyone in America, but it is competing. People have wonderful, images of Japan, but then they also have this kind of a report. And so what's your sense on how to overcome some of these factual data items that undermine the image of Japan?
Together with the optic of only having one female in the new cabinet. Yes, anyone like to take that? Steph.
Well, you can't change the image of this without changing the reality. So you just look at the numbers. So on OECD comparative figures, Japan comes near bottom on any measure of female empowerment that you could choose. It's not as bad as it was because the number of female graduates now is more or less the same as male graduates. So the schools and universities in Japan have done their job. The big obstacle remains big employers. Large companies, government institutions still favour they're run by men for men. I mean, and I can see this. I'm not going to say where, but I can see this.
I think, as I said, we're in a world where facts are meaning less and less, and the emotion is meaning more and more. And in examples like that, it is an ongoing journey. And I think in the Future of Work panel, we actually talked about the fact that the number of university-educated women in the workforce has gone from 15% to 50% in a relatively short amount of time in the past decade or so. So I think it's up to Japan to be talking about what they are doing to address the issue, rather than let the straight fact of that they are ranked 76th or whatever be the message that's being communicated. But it's a really good point about the optics of the reality against the message that is going out. Nancy.
Can I add to that in terms of ranking? I teach at Kyoto Gaidai. I'm a professor and writer. I write a lot about branding Japan in the world. If you look at the top 5 universities in Japan, actually the numbers of the world ranking universities have gone up. And this year it was much better. But the top 5, it's 1 out of 4 that has a female student. And Japan really caters to the elite universities. You want to go work at the Gaimsho, you go to Todai. I mean, it's just like A to B. So that keeps women back. 2, nobody's brought up the recent decision by the Osaka mayor to de-link in terms of sister city. That may not be a big deal to people, but symbolically, that was a story that went around the world. And I was talking about it on BBC. It also damages the image of Japan. It makes Japan look a little bit defensive regarding historical narratives.
Anyone want to take that one? Marcy?
No, I mean, being in Hollywood, we're constantly entrenched with the Me Too movement. When we're telling stories, we definitely talk about female empowerment. We make sure it's very, very diversified, and it's not just male and female, it's also just racial and also religious aspect. But I think the one thing is we're so secular in terms of the media information we get here, and I think we definitely need to be more open to hearing world news in Japan. We don't get that on our local channels. We only care about the things that happen domestically, and as a culture, I think we tend to be persuaded easily by the media and the Japanese media. So if the Japanese media is a lot more open about also not just the positive stuff, but also maybe some of the negative stuff of how Japan's being portrayed around the world, I think it's just the awareness. I just think a lot of people aren't aware that this is how Japan is being portrayed. So I think the media and maybe the government needs to do a little bit better job rather than just sweeping things under the rug, but putting both sides on, and then hopefully that will be a catalyst for change of some sort in the future.
I think in any complex world, and particularly on a national branding scale, which is your expertise, but there's always going to be incidents, right? The Japanese government cannot control what the mayor of Osaka decides to do. There will always be incidents. I think the key thing is to make sure that you have an overarching message for Japan that builds enough trust so that when those isolated incidents are seen, they are seen as isolated incidents and not as something that is consistent across the whole culture or across what Japan is trying to achieve. And in that particular case, it was so powerful as a story because I think it's a reputation issue and Japan just hasn't had the trust over that issue to be able to counterbalance that yet. Yeah.
I'm sorry to disagree, or maybe that's a good thing, I don't know, on a panel. I don't think it's an isolated incident. I think this is the Japanese narrative. If you're a foreign tourist and you come and want to learn something about Japanese history, and you want to go to a museum, let's say about the crucial period, the Second World War, let's be honest, where do you end up? You end up in the Yasukuni Museum, because that's the only one available. Now, if people see that as the central narrative, that's not an accident.
Good point. Yes?
It's very interesting. You were talking earlier about cultural houses, etc. part of the original brief for the Japan houses, of which I think there are now 3 around the world, 1 in London, was to create a correct view of history. That was part of the brief, right? Now, I'm very, very glad to say that that bit of the brief has gone. They're not now telling the Japanese side of the story on World War II. And they have evolved more into trying to do a more general job of cultural diplomacy. But I talked in preparing for this panel. Actually, I talked to a number of people, getting their thoughts on the topic we'd be discussing, how Japan showcases itself to the world. And every single one of them, both Japanese and foreign that I talked to, said Korea, said comfort women. That is part of the Japanese narrative as far as the world is concerned. And if we go back to 2007, Resolution 121 in the House of Representatives, it was the Japanese academic and political community that took out a full-page ad in the Washington Post saying the facts, just blasting the world with the Japanese official line on this, that contributed to the certain and sure vote to adopt that resolution. So Japan transmitting its own narrative and transmitting its own message can actually undermine itself if it doesn't build bridges, if it doesn't think from the other's perspective.
Good point. Per, you've...
Well, Ross mentioned Sweden, and it's true, since 40 years back, all Swedes speak English. International English, not British English. Very important. Reason 1, education, but more important, no dubbing, but subtitles. My children learn English from Dallas. So my question to you, when can you make sure get subtitles on all Japanese television shows? Then you will get automatic English all the time, and 20 years from now you will have changed the whole situation.
Subtitles. Masi, you're a producer.
So can you repeat? So you want it to be
Get rid of dubbing and have subtitles in English.
in Japan?
And in Japan, and also Japanese shows, you can have subtitles in English and everything. You will train the whole population.
Right. Well, I think
all the news programs.
right. I think the subtitling now is a little bit more prevalent because streaming places like Netflix, they have automated systems, and Japanese shows are now starting to make it across the waves. It's also the broadcasters aren't good at selling their shows abroad as a package, and they do need to be dubbed. But Netflix, Amazon, the Hulus of the world, they're making it a much more play and keeping the original voices. Even and also, but the anime as well. Some the fans around the world want to hear the original voices because that's part of the acting, and they want to connect with the voice actors, and they want to see that. So I think it has shifted towards that. In Japan, I don't know what to do about that. It's a part. I'm hoping that people is changing, and maybe the distributors need to make more of an effort to keep things more subtitled so people can actually listen to English. But that's the Japanese market is as you know is a unique one. So that is hard to say because they offer both choices, and it is a business. They need to make money, and the statistics show that dubbing makes more money than subtitling. So.
Perhaps you can start financing some. Yes, last question, please.
Hi, one specific question to Masi. You mentioned about this Tel Aviv influencer story, which is, I think, something interesting. And when you think about the 2 or 3 features or concepts or places that you would bring influencers from the West Coast, US, coming into Tokyo, right? You mentioned about the animes, the artists of the game. One other idea is about sustainability and longevity, like, tea ceremony, Urasenke teacher, 95 years old, totally perfect, right? And teaching things. I mean, that's something that's a little similar to the Jiro idea, but what are some of the 2, 3 distinctive features that you would, these influencers would be really excited to share about in Japan?
I mean, that's interesting. I mean, most people, as you say, they think about Tokyo and Kyoto and anime. You know, people every time they come to Japan, people want to go to the robot restaurant, things like that. It's the package of what people would expect Japan, and I think it's a mixture of that. You know, kind of showing things what people want, but you know, people talk about the high-tech toilets or something, but maybe take them to the factories that create them. You know, maybe I would also take them to maybe schools, because the Japanese schools are very unique and different from. You know, I would feed in a mix of the tradition and the new age, and also a lot of maybe more the eco technology. I think Japan has such a great is a leader in when it comes to ecological technology, and making them aware of that. I mean, is I think is of interest. You know, so there's definitely a lot of things, your standards with the food and stuff, but I think it's also using that as purely an entry point and expanding the platform of what makes Japan great. So.
Excellent. We have 3 minutes left. One more question. Anyone? Yes, Mori-san.
For Olympics 2020, it's going to be probably boiling hot summer. So what is your ideas of Omotenashi to keep everyone cool?
Good. Okay.
Fans. No, interestingly, I'm sure you're aware, you know, there was the last time that Tokyo hosted the Olympics, it was actually later in the year because of temperature, and there was a discussion as to whether it should be moved later in the year. The position at the moment is that it's fine where it is. I think people who had the summer in Tokyo this year, luckily I wasn't here, might disagree, and I know that there are some athletes around the world who are a little concerned about this for their competitions. I don't think there's not an easy answer. I think that you need to look at technological solutions, but if the spirit of Omotenashi, of really welcoming people, is going to work, you need to actually double that, because it's going to be quite uncomfortable in Tokyo. So you've got to work even harder to make people feel welcome.
Yeah, business opportunity there for all your entrepreneurs. How do we keep people cool during Olympics?
If I may, also, they should, on street side splash centres, you pick up basically a cold shower, and preferably one that's large enough to share with other people. And the youngsters will go in there with their T-shirts and jeans, and everybody will have a great time.
And maybe we can sleep in the daytime, and we can wake in the nighttime. So that is one of the things for the time. Yeah.
Let's maybe more netsama shito and stuff. No, but I think just be more innovative, more flexibility. You know, I think the government can be a little bit more flexible and not be so rigid. You know, we need to reward risks. We don't do that too well in Japan. So, you know, if people come up with new innovative ideas, like watering the streets, or putting a dome around Tokyo. Not that I'm advocating for that, but something like that. So I think it's just flexibility, and whatever solutions come up will be great.
Well, Singapore, I'm told, would never have become Singapore without air conditioning. So I'm sure someone will come up with a great idea as to how we can keep people the Olympics soon. Yes. Everybody, thank you very much. Thank you to the audience for their great participation. And thank you to my 4 panelists. Thank you very much.